So this video is going to be a little bit different than usual. It became apparent to me just before I posted my last video, the one about the Tasmanian chaos and their upcoming election, that when I hit upload on that in a number of days, I would be hitting 25,000 subscribers, which is almost hard for me to believe. So before I uploaded that video about Tasmania, I thought, well, I may as well, just like as a thank you, as a show of good faith for all the people that have come here and have supported me recently, that I would let my subscribers, my viewers, pick what I cover next. So I put out this poll. Unfortunately, we can't actually use ranked choice voting here unless I did like consecutive polls in a row. So using first past the post for this, when you guys were asked about what you wanted to see me cover, most of you, or sorry, not most of you, the largest group of you said that you wanted to see me cover the different political systems in each Australian state. So as a massive thank you to you guys for getting me a quarter of the way to the silver play button, that's kind of unbelievable to think about. I'm going to dive into the many differences from state to state of how politics works there, how the electoral systems are different, and what sort of outcomes those different systems lead to. So let's get right into it. The first two that I'm going to talk about at the same time are, in my opinion, the most boring and probably the least effective at representing the populations in their state/territory. And that is the political system that operates in both Queensland and in the Northern Territory. Within the Northern Territory and in Queensland, they have a system referred to as a unicameral parliament, meaning they don't have an upper house. There is only one legislature, and that is effectively where all government decisions are made with no second chamber for review. The way that these parliaments elect their members is that the state or territory is divided up into a number of seats, and then those seats elect one member to parliament, and that's pretty much it. As throughout all of Australia, these two places still use preferential voting, but they effectively have very, very simple political systems where there is minimal, if any, minor party representation. Anyway, those two boring ones out of the way, let's go over to WA, where, interestingly, they have actually gone through a massive reform when it comes to how their parliament works and how their parliament, specifically the upper house, is actually elected. In my opinion, they have gone from the worst, least democratic system for one of their chambers to one of the best. Now, WA, in the 2021 election and all elections prior, operated in a very interesting way. So you had the lower house, which was locally elected members, exactly like the Northern Territory and Queensland. But then their upper house was elected from regions. And the really, really worrying thing about that was that those regions all elected the same amount of people to Parliament, to the upper house, but they did so despite having massively different populations. The disparity here was almost unbelievable. Some of these regions in Perth would have 300,000 voters in them, and they would be electing a set amount of members for the Legislative Council. But then you would have regions far outside the cities in the mining areas where there would only be maybe 50,000 voters getting just as many representatives in the upper house. This system of malapportionment, as it was called, was effectively just a way to give the country more representation in government. But that system was removed after the 2021 election. You have probably heard me mention it before, but in the 2021 election, the Labor government led by Mark McGowan in WA was incredibly popular because of how successfully it had handled COVID. And they won the most comprehensive landslide victory in all of Australian history. And that gave them a majority in both chambers of the WA Parliament, which let them basically reform the entire system. The Western Australian Labor Party was able to reform the upper house, so instead of those regions, the entire state was basically treated as one big region, and all members of the Legislative Council were elected at one time. So there are 37 seats up for grabs in elections for WA's upper house, and the quota to get elected is just under 2.4% of the vote, which means that minor parties see a lot of success in elections into WA's upper house. Elections. They've only actually done one election this way, and that was this year. So in the single election under this system, it has been very beneficial for minor parties. At the moment, there is representation from the Greens, One Nation, the Legalised Cannabis Party, the Australian Christians, and I believe the Animal Justice Party currently in WA's upper house. WA is the only state in the country that conducts statewide proportional elections like this for their entire upper house. We're moving on to SA and New South Wales, and they do something similar, but they have a very interesting quirk to the system that makes it much harder for minor parties to get such large representation. So New South Wales and South Australia, the South Brothers, if you want to call them that, have pretty much identical political systems on a state level. Their lower houses, like most of the other places that we've looked at now, they have single-member seats, and that is where the government is actually formed. But then their legislative councils, their upper houses, while proportional, have a very interesting twist to them. The elections for the New South Wales and South Australian legislative councils are only conducted half at a time, which means that in any given election, take New South Wales for example, they have 42 seats in their proportional upper house, but they serve 8-year terms, and they only elect 21 of those seats every 4 years. The logic there, I suppose, is just that give people more experience up there. I mean, an 8-year term is a very long time in Australian politics for legislative councillors to actually be in Parliament. So, of course, there is a lot of expertise coming from that, but one of the consequences of it is that it makes it much harder for minor parties to get elected to New South Wales and South Australia's upper houses. You just make the comparison with WA. Over there, the quota to get elected into the upper house, since they're contesting all 37 seats in one election, is only 2.6-ish%. So it's very easy to hit that quota. But over here, that quota is going to be closer to 4.5% in New South Wales. And then in South Australia, where they only have 22 members of the upper house, electing 11 at a time, the quota to get elected is closer to 8.5%. But of course, this is a matter of subjectivity. You can think that is bad, or you can think that is good. Of course, one of the best arguments in favour of how South Australia and New South Wales do it is that it keeps some fringe parties out. And like, take Western Australia once again. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, I have more subscribers currently, my wonderful subscribers who I'm again thanking, than the Animal Justice Party got first preference votes to get their member into Parliament over there. That does two things. That shows you how incredibly easy it is to get into the upper house in Western Australia, and how incredibly impressive the subscriber numbers have been recently. And once again, thank you guys. Okay, Victoria. As we've talked about with all these other states and the one territory, their lower house in Victoria, single-member seats where preferential voting is used, but the Legislative Council in Victoria is interesting because it works now the way that Western Australia's used to operate. For their Legislative Council elections, Victoria divides the state up into 8 regions, but unlike what WA was doing, they actually, in Victoria, have roughly the same population from region to region, and all of these regions elect 5 members to the Legislative Council. That system, in its own way, does kind of damage the prospects of minor parties again, because you are electing every member at once, but you're breaking them into regions, so the quota to get elected is not like statewide, it's in these specific regions. So a party like the Greens, where they could probably easily hit a quota if it was way lower, getting the votes from across the entire state, they have to get it specifically in these areas at a much higher rate. Okay, that is most of the mainland, but we've got the ACT and Tasmania to look at. And these are the odd couple. They are very unique in how they conduct elections in comparison to all the other states and one territory. Both the ACT, Australia's Capital Territory, and Tasmania use a Hare-Clark electoral system, which basically means for their House of Government, they are using the system that Victoria uses in its upper house, but for their lower house. They are the only 2 states and territories, or rather state and territory, where the lower house uses some sort of proportional representation, however flawed it is, to elect members to the House to form government. This is how it works in the ACT's case. They have 25 members of their assembly, and the territory is divided into 5 divisions, and each of those proportionally will elect 5 members. 5 and 5, 25. That's how the ACT works. The consequence of this electoral system, where the Greens can be very well represented, and considering it's also the most left-wing part of the country, it essentially means that The Labour Party has no real competition here. They have been in power for decades now, and the Liberal Party just does not have a practical base to get elected there, and there's no way that they could outperform the combined vote of the Greens and the Labour Party, who from time to time operate as a coalition or through confidence and supply. So that is it for the ACT. They are unicameral. They do not have a second chamber. This is it. This is their entire political system. But now we're going to look at Tasmania, which I've said that they're one of the odd ones out, but they do have an upper house in Tasmania, and the way that they run things down there is so profoundly weird. So, like I mentioned, Tasmania, their lower house where government is formed, they use the same system as the ACT. They have 5 divisions, but they elect 7 members from those proportionally. But where things get really weird in Tasmania is that their upper house functions the way that all the other states' lower houses operate. For the upper house elections to Tasmania's Legislative Council, the state is divided into 15 districts where a single member is elected. So they essentially do the inverse of what most other states do, where most states you have a lower house where it is single member electorates and then a somewhat proportional upper house if you even have one. But Tasmania, where they are forming government in their lower house, they have a somewhat proportional system, but then their upper house is single member seats. And part of what makes that so fascinating is the fact that Tasmanian politics is extremely local. And that is why Tasmania's upper house is the only chamber of any parliament in Australia where a majority of the representatives are independents. And I think this is really interesting because Tasmania, their system actually does make sense if you think about their population. Tasmania doesn't even have 600,000 people there. And their upper house, their legislative council, when you divide the population into 15 groups, it means that actual people voting there, like voting age people, excluding people under the age of 18, you only get about 20,000 or so people voting in these 15 single member electorates, which means that the competition there and the elections that are run there are hyper fixated on very specific local issues. So yeah, the major parties can come in and win those seats, but if you have a popular local mayor in any town in Tasmania, realistically, that person is going to have a better connection and very easily manage to find their way into the upper house because, well, they're just the bloke from your town. Once again, bringing it back to subscribers, if we were a town in Tasmania, all 25,000 of us, we would qualify to get our own seat in Tasmania's upper house. It is such a strange system down there. But anyway, I think that's it. I've covered them all. We've done, WA, South Australia, New South Wales, Queensland, gently touched on the Northern Territory, Victoria, ACT, Tasmania. I sincerely hope I'm not forgetting anywhere. I don't think I am. I would be very bad at my job if I was. But anyway, that, put pretty compactly, is how Australian states operate on a political level. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, and thank you for suggesting the topic. It was incredibly interesting and fun, talking about how much of a nerd I am. It was incredibly interesting and fun to look up all these state political systems and appreciate how different they were from state to state, from territory to territory. And thank you guys for your continued support, the way that you interact with the polls that I do put out there. The feedback is always amazing. I genuinely appreciate the support you've shown, not just for this video here, but for the entire channel. And I really look forward to the next one of these videos that I get to put together. So guys, thank you once again.